My family really enjoys watching superhero movies, especially because the two youngest members of our family recognize all of the characters, so even if they don't understand the live action films, they can still point and say, hey, that's Superman, that's Batman, or that's Spider-Man. Now, Spider-Man is the one that we watch the most because, well, we own that trilogy, so obviously we're going to see that more often than the others. And one of the lines that my family likes to quote a lot is when Uncle Ben looks at Peter Parker or Spider-Man and says, Peter, with great power comes great responsibility. Now, this statement is absolutely true, but it is also true that when your enemies have great power, you have an even greater responsibility because you have to be able to combat your enemies. You have to be able to stand a chance against the bad guys. And today, we're going to be discussing what needs to be done in order for one country to defeat their bad guys, because they are facing a very powerful enemy. The question that I've been posed with today is, what can Kenya do to stop terrorist attacks? And my answer to this question is they need to think outside of their own borders. Now, to give you some background on the question, recently in Kenya, just as in most of Africa, there have been a series of terrorist attacks that have killed hundreds of people, especially in the major marketplaces inside of Kenya. These terrorists are targeting villages that are kind of on the outskirts of all of the big cities and big towns, but they're starting to work their way inward, so this obviously poses a serious national security threat. Now, there are two reasons why Kenya needs to think outside of their own borders. The first is that they are facing an outside threat. And the second is that there is global support available for them. They do not need to fight this battle alone. But before we jump into these 2 points, I would like to provide a justification for the question, or why you should even care about it. After all, you don't live in Kenya, so what do their terrorist attacks have to do with you? Well, the central idea we'll be discussing in this speech is that of African stabilization. If Kenya falls to terrorists, if they do not think outside of their own borders, the entirety of this continent is at risk. And that will impact everyone, especially because the United States has interests directly involved inside of Africa. So let's jump into the first point, discussing the idea of the outside threat, that Kenya needs to start thinking outside of Kenya because that's where their enemies are coming from. Now, The Guardian stated on May 10th that terrorism is not a threat for one country. It is a threat for all of Africa. And the Jerusalem Post stated that terrorists were actually found from Africa on the West Bank. So this is a mobile threat. They don't even stay just inside of Africa. CNN stated on May 21st that attacks are mounting in violence, but the people that are members of these terrorist organizations don't just attack their home source. They're attacking all the countries around them as well. And Foreign Affairs stated on May 19th that they should not wait for the international community to start addressing the problem, because this is not just a Kenyan problem or a Nigerian problem or a problem for Mali. It's a problem for the entire continent of Africa. And CNN stated on May 21st that northern and central Nigeria are the source of the threat. But according to Amnesty International, the threat is moving from Nigeria because they want to have influence across Africa as a whole. And according to the New York Times on May 7th, while the sources are from Nigeria, they want to spread the war front because they want to be able to get more supporters, more militants, and more supplies for their cause. So yes, Kenya has seen violent attacks, but the source of these attacks is from Nigeria. So they need to start thinking outside of their own borders. But the second reason why they need to think outside of their own borders is that the global community is willing to help them fight this war. There are massive resources available for them to take advantage of. As CNN stated on May 17th, the nations of Africa are unified under one banner, the banner of fighting terrorism. And And Reuters stated on the same day that the nations of Africa have declared total war on terrorism, and they are firmly resolved to defeat this growing threat. Sun News then stated on May 7th that even outside of Africa there is support, because France, Britain, China, and the United States have all offered military aid to the governments of Africa in order to combat their terrorism threats. And then Fox News stated on May 10th that the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of Britain is not only making plans to help combat the threats that currently exist, but they're making plans to help Africa in the future, to ensure that, yes, they deal with the problems facing them right now, but that when the terrorists start making attacks in the future, they'll also be ready to combat those threats as well. And then BBC stated just today, on May 23rd, that Rwandan President Paul Kagame said that the African presidents must take responsibility for their policy decisions that helped get the terrorists where they are now, and they must work together. They can't wait for Europe to invite them to an anti-terrorism conference, and they can't wait for the United Nations to pass sanctions as they did this morning. They need to come together, make a coalition, and make a plan, and they are willing to do that. With great power comes great responsibility. But when your enemies are strong, and your enemies want to take over an entire continent, you can't just worry about your own borders. You need to think outside of the box, and you need to reach out to the people that are willing to help you in order to make sure that you effectively and quickly defeat this force that is not only mounting on your own people, but on people across your continent. And that's what Kenya can do to stop terrorist attacks. Thank you.